to have you with us and seeking the endorsement from our revolution. Again, the Facebook page is live streaming, and you can find this on our YouTube channel if you're not able to join us in real time. So very briefly, and Henry, I'm seeing our beautiful graphic up there, so thanks so much for that. We just want to let you know that if you're new to the organization, our Revolution Massachusetts is organizing a grassroots political revolution, challenge power to prioritize the needs of all people and our planet. We're building statewide movement by focusing and fighting for economic, racial, social, sexual, gender, and environmental justice for all. So we're here for you. We can't educate people about the endorsed candidate or advocate on issues without participation. So that's why we're so glad that you're here with us today. We run on the efforts of volunteers and the contributions of donors. Take a moment to volunteer or make a donation. Please check the links in the chat. You're going to see our homepage, our volunteer link, and the link to donate. So we hope you'll explore all three. This morning, helping us get questions from our Revolution members are Henry Wardis of our Revolution Cambridge and Martha Carshare of our Revolution Jamaica Plain and the Jamaica Plain Progressives, who will present the questions. As our time is limited, I'm going to roll right in and just give you a little bit of a biographical background of Andrea before inviting her to introduce herself and her campaign. So growing up in Roxbury, Andrea's life was filled with instability. When Andrea was 8 months old, she lost her mother to a car accident while going to visit her father in prison. She and her brothers bounced around, living with relatives and sometimes in foster care, until her father got out of prison when she was 8 years old and she met him for the first time. Andrea and her family relied on public housing and food assistance while her grandmother struggled with alcoholism. Her two brothers sadly cycled in and out of the prison system, and she lost her twin brother, Andre, when he passed away in the custody of the Department of Corrections as a pretrial detainee. She graduated from Boston Latin and then worked her way through college with the help of grants and student loans, graduating from Princeton University and UCLA Law School. She worked as the legal services attorney for the Ed Law Project, and then she served as the general counsel at the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission, working across 101 cities and towns to address regional challenges. Then Andrea served as the legal counsel to Deval Patrick. In 2015, Andrea successfully ran for Boston City Council, becoming the first woman to represent District 4 on the council. And her first piece of legislation was the Community Preservation Act, which still generates over $20 million annually for new affordable housing, historic preservation, and parks and open space. In 2018, she was unanimously elected City Council President, the first Black woman to hold the title. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Andrea. Please, 2 minutes to share more about your campaign before we jump into questions.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for having me. It is definitely sunny. Well, it's not sunny yet in Boston, but it soon will be. It's almost supposed to be, I think, 90 degrees today and over 90 tomorrow. So I do hope everyone is, if you're here in this warm state, staying hydrated and cool, of course. But I'm really honored to be here with each and every one of you and appreciate your leadership and your work. It's a difficult time, frankly, to be politically engaged and involved. It's a very divisive time in our country in many ways, including, of course, with this recent incident in Buffalo. So I am grateful to each and every one of you for the work that you do every single day. I jumped into the Attorney General race really recognizing that families are struggling right now and worried about whether or not they're going to rebound and prosper and thrive coming out of COVID. I do think families are also frustrated with government and don't necessarily see government as a solution. And what I've been stressing is not only do I think we live in the best state in the nation, but that government and the Attorney General's office can indeed help residents with a whole host of things. And how do I know we live in the best state in the nation? Amanda, you just gave my full, painful, tragic background. All of my biological grandparents are deceased. I mean, all of my biological parents and grandparents are deceased. And of course, and sadly, I lost my twin brother, Andre, 10 years ago. And yet through the midst of all of that, I had incredible access to opportunity to allow me to become the first in my family to go to college and the first in my family to go to law school and become a lawyer. And I've dedicated my entire life through all of those career opportunities that you mentioned, representing children in education cases for free, working for Governor Deval Patrick as an attorney, and so many other roles and responsibilities, ensuring every family had access to opportunity in this state. And I'm running for Attorney General, stressing that this office is more than just the chief law enforcement office. Yes, enforce our laws equitably and fairly, but it has the tools, the resources, and the talent to make sure every family has access to health care, excellent education for their children, all the tools, of course, to buy a home, stay in their home, every tool to ensure they have access to a living wage, to benefits, that they're protected against predatory practices, especially our seniors, every tool to address racial disparities, prison reform, criminal legal reform, public corruption, all the tools, of course, to ensure the neighborhoods in which we live or raising our children. And I have two beautiful boys, that those neighborhoods are more resilient and more prepared for the next climate event or even the next pandemic. And I'm honored to have the support of Senator Markey in this race, Environmental League of Massachusetts, so many elected officials across every county in Massachusetts, but I'm not taking anything or anyone for granted. We are working hard, getting out there, and I would be honored, of course, to have your support and happy to be here with you to answer your questions. So thank you for having me. I don't know if there's a timer, but I am being mindful given the time constraints.
Well, like I mentioned before we came on, you're the only candidate in this forum right now. And so I will just kind of give you a heads up. I wanted to let you have a full open, and that was really, really, we're appreciative.
Thank
Okay,
you.
the first question, Martha or Henry, who is going to start in?
Martha.
Okay.
Fine. So
Hi,
welcome, Andrea, and I'll ask you the first question. What are the main changes you would make from your predecessor to the Attorney General's role or priorities?
I always believe in giving, of course, credit where credit's due. And I know our current Attorney General has a national reputation of really tackling climate and the environment, as well as the opioid crisis. And I would continue that leadership and be even more bold and courageous on those issues, including pulling in more communities of color and some of our rural communities as well. But where I think I would go even further is prioritizing criminal legal reform, prison reform, police reform, juvenile justice. I see all of those issues as falling under one umbrella that we need to continue to do serious work on. I still have loved ones who are incarcerated. I mentioned, of course, the story of my twin brother, Andrea. But what is coming up in many conversations is that the conditions in which we confine folks are still troubling. Someone even mentioned a recent report that describes some conditions as torture in the DDU unit at Walpole Prison, for example. In addition to that, we still see misappropriation of funds, police misconduct in different municipalities in the state, examples of public corruption, of course, juvenile justice. There are still stark racial disparities and low income disparities in our criminal legal system, in our juvenile detention facilities. So I would take on those issues with a fierceness and boldness and prioritize them. The other two pieces I want to mention is racial disparities. We see them in our healthcare system, our economic system, environmental injustice, you name it. Really important to take on those issues. And of course, living in this skin, in this gender, in this identity, I don't feel like I have the luxury not to, but I know that folks in this state really want us to do better with respect to closing those inequities. And then the last piece is helping the family. I think the office can take a more intersectional approach. Every family is dealing with different things. One family is concerned, of course, about PFAS being in their water. That same family is concerned about a lack of access to healthcare, mental health especially. That same family is worried about wage theft. The AG's office can, I think, be more intersectional in helping a family because all the divisions in the units live under one umbrella. So I want to see a more intersectional approach coming out of the office, and I think residents do too.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Henry?
Yes. So what role do you feel the Attorney General's office has in supervising local police departments throughout the state? What role should the Attorney General's office have with respect to the locals? And yeah, those are the two.
I think it's a critical role, and it sounds almost like one, but there is a critical role for the Attorney General's office to play, not only over the state police, obviously, which is statewide, and one unit of the state police exists within the Attorney General's office, but also with respect to other public safety agencies within our municipalities. as I have been crisscrossing the state, what I have been learning is that folks are really concerned about misappropriation of funds, which is happening in various municipalities, police misconduct, the lack of diversity in our public safety agencies, the lack of transparency as well. And so there is a critical role for the AG's office to play because these are our statewide issues. I often say, if you want a candidate that's going to be bold and courageous on those issues, it is me. I chaired the City Council Committee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice for 6 years. And under my leadership, we now have body cameras in the city of Boston, which is an accountability tool that people say is working. We have the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency and a civilian review board under that office. That is historic in the state. I've put forth reports on how to diversify public agencies and public safety agencies in Boston. That is what other municipalities want to see. I was recently in one community where the mayor said, I want body cameras here too. So the AG's office has to drive these conversations. And I think if you're working in partnership with the state police in all of these municipalities, all 351, and having the statewide conversation, every municipality can have these accountability tools. Every municipality can, of course, increase their diversity or learn from each other, where some municipalities have done that really well, and share best practices. Every municipality can have a system or an Office of Police Accountability and Transparency to make sure all misconduct complaints or anything else have a place that can be addressed. And these aren't just for residents, of course. These are for officers and public safety officials too, because the critical piece is building trust. And all of them are going to have to be at the table, but we need systems in place. And the AG's office uniquely positioned to drive those conversations.
Thank you. Martha.
What can the AG do to reform or abolish civil asset forfeiture?
So I've been, of course, in a lot of conversations on the reforms, and there's a whole committee that's been doing work through the legislature on these issues for some time. And I think there's a role for the AG to play. Some of the recommendations have been less about abolishing it, but really making sure that that system is more transparent and folks have a sense of the process, folks have a sense of how the resources are garnished and, of course, where they will be distributed to. And so I think the AG's office has a role to play in pushing for some of the recommendations that have already been, I think, put out, or maybe will be coming soon, implementation of some of those ideas. But I also think it needs to be a statewide conversation. As I am crisscrossing the state and talking to district attorneys and talking to other law enforcement officials, there is a silo, some of it is a siloed conversation. Not many folks are even at the table having the conversation. So while there's a commission and a committee doing work on this, I think the AG's office has an incredible power to convene, to bring more people together, and to ensure that that process is fairer, more transparent, and that the public has a sense of how those resources are garnished, of course, and making sure that they don't disproportionately affect, I will say, residents of color or those of color or poor residents who don't have adequate attorneys to fight for them. Who there's some examples, of course, of injustice where you haven't been convicted of anything and yet all of your stuff has been taken and being held. So I just think there's a lot more to do, and the AG's office has to play a more critical role.
Thank you so much. Henry.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a follow-up to my previous question on local departments. So several Massachusetts cities, Amherst, Cambridge, Lynn, Northampton, for instance, have moved or are in the process of moving most of their emergency response services out of their police departments.
That's right.
There's also a bill, the ACES bill, that would provide financial support for such efforts across the Commonwealth. Do you support these efforts as a means of increasing community health and safety? Do you think these efforts will reduce costs?
I do support these efforts, and they've been conversations that have been happening in communities for some time, even before George Floyd, looking at alternatives to policing and more effective models of policing, especially in the context of mental health, even domestic violence, drug abuse, substance use disorder. Who is the appropriate person or expert to show up? And we know in many instances, it is not a police officer. Even if that police officer has training, even then, it is not necessarily a police officer to respond to a mental health case. It is a clinician. It is someone who has a greater expertise. And there's also, of course, been a movement to move this human capital out of our police departments to be separate units where they work in partnership, but where they have a separate unit. I was recently in Amherst. I was actually visiting an organization that's dealing with food insecurity. Talk about a major statewide issue still. But this agency talked about how they really appreciated the new model coming out of Amherst, because sometimes some of their clients do come in with mental health concerns and are disruptive in such a way that they do have to call someone to help and support them, but they don't want to call a police officer, obviously. And so I think if we want to see more of this in more municipalities, funding is critical. There are different, whether it's legislation at the State House, there's also, of course, resources available in an AG's office in other revenue streams to try these different ideas. And it's something I fully support.
Thank you so much. Martha?
Do you support a moratorium on the construction of new prisons? For instance, a proposal to build a new $52 million women's prison is under consideration. Do you think it should be built?
No, we don't need any new prisons in Massachusetts. If anything, we need resources directed to reentry services to help folks where they're still behind the wall gain access to training, educational opportunities, all the things they would need to be successful when they got out. And then mental health, drug abuse, food insecurity, all the other things our families are grappling with, including trauma. And so we don't need new prisons. Redirect those resources to the places that actually reduce recidivism and actually reduce incarceration rates in the state.
Okay, I'll jump in. Regulatory processes shape how much information the public receives about the conditions that incarcerated people face in their confinement. How can you use existing policies to bring more transparency to our prisons and jails? And what further transparency rules would you advocate for?
These are issues, as you can imagine, I care deeply about. My whole life has been connected to prison systems. I'm probably the only candidate in this race that has visited many prisons in Massachusetts as a young child, and then of course as an adult, showing up to support my brothers as best I could or other relatives, or when I was taking on certain types of education cases, going to detention facilities with young people to ensure they had access to opportunity and an excellent education. And so I care deeply about these issues. And one, say all that to say, not only will I continue the work, because personally it matters, but professionally, it will be an issue that is prioritized in the AG's office in ways that it hasn't been in the past. The best thing about the AG's office, unlike the governor or any other elected official in this state, is that you are the state's attorney. You have the power and the authority, of course, to represent the Department of Correction, the House of Correction, all of these state agencies. And what does that mean then? It affords you incredible leverage to push these agencies to do and be better, to push them to adjust not only policy, but culture in terms of transparency and the release of information, to push them to actually comply with existing public records laws and other laws that require them to be transparent when they're not. And then, of course, you can go even farther than that. As people, of course, filing lawsuits against the state about horrific things happening in our prison, an AG can step up and say, we're not going to represent an agency in certain types of cases where people's humanity is being violated, where transparency laws and regulations are being violated, or certain accountability laws are being violated. So you can stand up and say, I'm not going to represent you, go get your other attorney. And then, of course, at the extreme end is even when that agency gets another attorney to say to them, you can't take a legal position in court. That is major power that the AG's office has to push for these institutions to do better. And under my leadership, that's exactly what would happen. I do think there's laws on the books that encourage greater transparency than we actually get from these agencies. Many refer to the Department of Correction and others as dark holes or dark agencies. That's unacceptable. And we can change that, in the AG's office uniquely positioned to do just that.
Thank you so much. I believe we're back to Martha.
Right. So I'm going to jump to health as a category and want to know if you support Medicare for all, also known as single payer healthcare, and what role you think the AG should play in the health services industries.
Thank you for that question. Obviously, I've followed single payer healthcare for a long time, including looking at Vermont, where my husband is actually from, and what didn't work there. And I like to also, of course, get out there and to talk to constituents about something I can deliver right now for them in the short term, while also, of course, in the long term, working towards a goal. I do think single payer is something that is long term and something that has to be a national conversation for it to happen. And I think there's some lessons to learn from Vermont and other communities that are having this conversation. And so I think an AG should absolutely be at that table, should absolutely be encouraging this long-term ideal situation that I think has to have a national conversation. In the short term, there is a lot the AG's office can do to ensure every single resident and family has access to healthcare that is affordable, accessible, and gender affirming. One is in Massachusetts, we've close to figured out the coverage issue. There's only a 2% gap. And there are some studies, of course, that show that some of that 2% in terms of coverage, they don't want coverage or they don't want to be bothered for whatever reason. We don't know why. And then maybe there's a small, very small percentage, maybe it's 1% or less, that we can, of course, work to ensure that we are getting to universal coverage in this state. I think the major issues right now in Massachusetts are cost and the drivers of cost and high cost. I think the AG's office has a role to play in reviewing some of these transactions of our larger healthcare institutions. I think the AG's office has a role to play ensuring that our community-based health centers, including those in communities of color, as well as in rural communities, poor white rural communities, are resourced. They're working with those institutions to ensure their business models are sustainable going forward so they can provide low cost care and coverage and accessible coverage and healthcare to those communities. I think the other place the AG's office must show up is disparities in health, racial disparities. I've been in several conversations about Black maternal health where the AG's office can be doing more. Access to mental health. I was in Berkshire County. If you're a young person in crisis, good luck trying to find a bed. There are resources in the AG's office, I think, to change that and to make those changes in make those changes in. This is a time to be doing coalition building. We're talking about the same thing in these poor communities, but yet it is not a coalition that's come together. No other state, I think, has really figured out how to do that well. Massachusetts, I think, has an opportunity as we take on these issues to bring communities together to ensure that every community has access and to deal with the cost issues, to deal with the disparities, and to absolutely ensure everyone has access to mental health services, which are critical coming out of COVID.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Apologies for the interruption as
No
you're,
problem.
in the recording, and we went a little bit over 2 minutes, but that was a very comprehensive answer for an issue that's very important to our membership. So thank you.
And I want folks to know, if I can just stress and elaborate, Amanda, nothing is black and white for me, right? It's always about listening and being thoughtful. But what I recognize as I'm getting out there is that families right now are struggling. I live in Mattapan in Boston. It's one of the poorest communities in Mattapan. And there are folks who are still struggling in terms of cost, in terms of maternal health issues, in terms of health disparities that we can address right now, while looking, of course, for some of the other topics, single payer and others, to work on those issues. But I want folks to know that the timeline for that is longer than some other solutions that are on the table as well.
Thank you. Henry.
Yeah. Do you think that you will be able to and plan to investigate and prosecute crimes committed in connection with illegal foreclosures, which are epidemic these days? The current AG has rejected criminal referrals in about 4 dozen such cases and has never prosecuted a single one. What's your plan?
I think right now, with residents really concerned about a potential foreclosure crisis coming out of COVID, I mean, it exists now, but there's a lot of angst in the community. So I've been stressing how much an AG can actually do in the context of housing, because this fear of a foreclosure crisis exists in communities. And so I do think every option should be on the table, especially if anyone is taking advantage of our residents. This is consumer protection. This is one of the basic responsibilities, of course, of an AG, is to protect our residents. And I think in the past, some innovative things were done to work with financial institutions to keep people in their homes, of course, to establish grant programs as well, to afford residents access to capital, to buy a home, to grow their wealth, all things the AG's office can do. But if there are big or persistent bad actors, just as we take on bad actors in the climate context or bad actors in the opioid crisis context, we should always be looking at who are the bad actors in every other context. And it may be something the AG's office takes on directly or works with our district attorneys on, who have closer relationships to their counties and their residents. So sometimes it may be a better partnership to do it through a district attorney or to do it in partnership. But I think it's a conversation that should be had.
Thank you very much. Martha?
Another housing question. Would you advocate for Massachusetts to codify housing as a human right and then use that codification as a way to hold the government of Massachusetts accountable if its housing policies cause displacement of vulnerable populations?
Yes. I won't even take the housing as a human right. Yes, yes, and yes, especially given mental health and housing are the top issues coming up in every single conversation we're having in the context of this race.
Okay, so although renters are considered consumers, public housing residents are not. And even if they work and do not receive a rental subsidy, do you think this should be different? And how about public housing residents who are disabled or on a fixed income? How can they be protected from sanitary code and fair housing violations?
First of all, thank you for this question. It has never come up in the context of this race. And one thing I always stress about my candidacy is for any issue we're talking about, whether it's housing, wage theft, the environment, always making sure it is inclusive to include everybody. And in the housing context, sometimes the folks who live in public housing are left out. Disability community, the same thing, LGBTQ+, even seniors. So I really appreciate your question, Henry. I grew up in public housing, and we at moments had conditions that no one should have been living in, and felt very powerless to change those conditions or circumstances, of course. And so even as a local city councilor, I did a lot of work helping to improve the public housing conditions in my district that I represented, even brought in programming that was moving folks out of public housing and into homeownership opportunities, never forgetting those folks who often feel left out and left behind. And so I do think there is significant policy changes that need to be made so they are included and counted as a consumer. And if we really are serious about this work, they are the most vulnerable, given the imbalance of power, given the poverty and the conditions of poverty, and the fact they're working 2 or 3 jobs and don't have time to always participate in the proceedings or hearings or to write letters. And of course, this also includes a large immigrant population that may not speak English as their first language. So I think these are the communities and areas we absolutely need to show up. And again, another opportunity to do a coalition building. It's not just in the urban centers, of course, in our state. There's public housing in other communities as well, where it's also residents who are white, who are also grappling with these issues. So coalition building can also happen in this space too.
Thank you. Martha?
Another health-related question. How would your office advance the decriminalization of substance use and shift to a public health model? And do you support safe drug use sites?
Thank you for that question. I think that's in many ways underway in the state, the decriminalization piece. Some of these conversations obviously happening at the state level, and there's more to do legislatively. People are having different conversations on what that can look like. But what I've been really impressed to learn, and maybe it's been a little surprising, as I go to other counties, especially in Western Mass, there are task force and sheriffs working with the district attorney and working with the register of probate, who is working with families and working with community-based organizations to say, we don't want to incarcerate or criminalize those folks who are dealing with opioid crisis, substance use disorder, drug abuse, because we see that as coping mechanisms for losing your job, coping mechanisms for poverty, coping mechanisms for dealing with COVID, isolation, mental health concerns. Some of this innovation is already happening on the ground. And if anything, I think maybe they want an AG to show up even more in those spaces to share those best practices across other counties, to create these task forces that are doing case management, looking at cases, individualized cases to ensure folks don't end up in the system. And even if they do in a house of correction, this particular sheriff was talking about not only all the tools to help folks with any type of disorder they have or disease, but to then give them the resources to get out and of course clear their records, which I think the AG's office on the record piece, whether it's sealing and expungement, could also be showing up on, especially in the context of marijuana. And then safe injection sites, I think was that your other question at the end?
Right, yes.
So I have been on the record supporting it at a municipal level. In Boston, for example, there was a major appetite amongst different folks to push for that. Somerville, the same thing. Certain communities are having these conversations at the municipal level. And I do not think an AG should stand in the way of any municipality or any process for that to happen. At the statewide level, I think there needs to be more conversation, because as I'm crisscrossing the state, there is concern about cost, of course. There's absolutely concern about site location and where they will go, and concern in communities of color and poor communities that these facilities will go in those communities unfairly. And I think there's some legitimate reason for angst. And so if it's a statewide conversation, I do think there needs to be more conversation on that. I think the AG, of course, can be a part of that along with our next governor. But I also recognize it has to be a tool amongst many others in terms of harm reduction to address the crisis. And I also know there is a crisis, not only in the context of opioids, but other drug use as well, that this state will have to address and the AG's office will have to continue to take the lead on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd just like to stop in and say we just have a few more minutes. So Henry, this might be the last question we have an opportunity for before your official closing, Andrea. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. All right. If it's going to be, I think we got a few more minutes.
If we can squeeze in a couple more,
Yeah,
please.
yeah, we can. We're good.
Okay.
I'm watching the time. Okay.
Good enough.
All right. There's a striking difference in the amount of wealth held by white people and Black people in Massachusetts. The figure of $250,000 versus $8 has been established. Most individual wealth is in the form of a home.
That's
Do you
right.
see a means to address this in the near term? Does restitution play a role in your thinking on this question?
Have been following those numbers for some time, including as a local elected official previously in Boston, following that Fed report, which when the second one came out, showed that some of those disparities actually got worse, which told me that government is clearly not doing enough to close these gaps. I care deeply about these issues because for me, the work has always been about breaking generational cycles of poverty and trauma and incarceration. For my two boys, for example, I'm a first-time homeowner in Mattapan. I'm very proud of that. That is breaking a cycle. I know how significant that is for other families, especially families of color. And so I do think the AG's office, through a racial equity lens, through restitution, there are a whole host of ways to ensure that that office, working with other governmental agencies at the local, state, and federal level, ensuring that folks have access to capital to buy a home, including folks who live in public housing, or to start a business, which is another significant way. I like to focus on home ownership because if you have a home, you can also take the capital out of your home to start a business. It's a very creative tool to use. In addition to that, there are a whole host of reports about how difficult it is for a family, especially a Black family, to get access to capital for a loan to start a business, to buy a home. So these issues around discrimination in terms of just economic capital and access I see as the same conversation, also need to be pulled in because there's a way in which to, of course, work with banks, but also to hold financial institutions accountable for those discriminatory practices, which we know still exist. And we're seeing that out of reports from the federal government, of course, and of course, local reports here. And then the last piece I'll stress is education and the focus on children and building wealth, whether it's bonds programs, there's all type of innovative things to help children also establish wealth early on. So we need to train and afford our parents access to these programs, these sort of lessons that we probably take for granted for our own families. So it's not just the adults, it's also children, where you can start to create wealth opportunities for children in different ways. And we're seeing innovative programs across the country that the AG's office could also be focusing on here, working with our treasurer and so many others in the state.
Thank you. Martha.
This is a question about campaign finance. Will you publicly renounce, support, and refuse funds from any political action committees funded by or representing companies and individuals that fuel and profit from climate change, or from large developers and other real estate interests, or from health industries like hospitals, pharmaceuticals, or medical technology companies?
In this race, we are on the record of not receiving or accepting money from those who profit off of climate, certain fossil fuel companies, alcohol companies, certain types of tobacco companies, pharma. There are a whole host of restrictions we've applied to ourselves. One of the things I want to stress is this is going to be, all candidates agree, a $2 million or $2.5 million race. And what I'm really proud of is that there is no PAC money in this race. There is no corporate money in this race. All of my contributions come from individuals. We've raised close to $800,000 in this race, and close to 95% of my donations are from Massachusetts residents, compared to my other two opponents, where 50% of their money comes from out of state. So in addition to restrictions on certain types of money that we will not take, I'm also focused on building a grassroots people-powered campaign where I'm asking Massachusetts residents to invest in me and invest in my candidacy. They've done that thus far, and we will continue that. The other piece I want to stress is I have been endorsed by the Environmental League of Massachusetts. I'm really proud of that. We've fought for that because of the work they do. I'm mindful of the fact that they have a PAC, and they've supported candidates who are bold and courageous on issues related to the environment. And particularly in my race and with my candidacy, they believe me to be the best candidate to pull in communities of color and poor rural communities into the climate and environmental justice conversations. And so at some point they may decide to do whatever, I don't know. We can never coordinate, it's illegal to do that. But I did want to acknowledge them, because technically given the role and responsibility, the role of that entity. But that being said, individual Massachusetts residents are who's donating to our campaign, and we want to keep it that way.
Thank you. Henry, we have time for one more?
A couple more, we're good. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So
Yeah,
red
2
states, so red states are trying to make access to gender affirming care or traveling to a state like Mass for gender affirming care a felony. And something similar could be said about abortions as well. Do you commit to making
I'm sorry,
sure?
you cut out just a little bit, Henry. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, red states are trying to make access to gender affirming care or traveling to another state for that care a felony, and they're doing the same for abortions. Do you commit to making sure that the Attorney General's office doesn't cooperate with out-of-state investigations into healthcare and refuse to extradite to states that ban gender-affirming care or abortions? And would you be able to commit to providing free legal services for those people who make it to Massachusetts?
Yes, and this has, as you can imagine, been coming up given the recent leaked memo from the Supreme Court. And we know other rights, given the composition of this court, are going to be under threat in the context of reproductive health care, of course, but the environment, civil rights, those in our LGBTQ plus community, you name it. And so that is a critical role for the AG, to always stand up for our people and to not just tell them they will be protected, to take action to ensure they are protected. So I do know our current AG in the office is working with the legislature to try to pass legislation quickly, similar to Connecticut and New York, to ensure there is, to address criminal liability, civil liability, of course, extradition. And I'm confident that will happen. But if it doesn't under this current administration, we will push that under my leadership, of course, because it's going to be critically important going forward. And we know more people will come here because of the laws we already have codified in this state.
Andrea, we do understand that you have another commitment, and we thank you for your time here today. You've given us
Thank
such a
you.
wide-ranging set of material and answers to consider, so thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And like I said, hope to earn your support, and really honored to be on today, working hard. It is probably close to 90 degrees in Boston today. So I feel hot in this room that I am because we don't have an AC or anything like that. But I'm really happy to be on with all of you. Thank you for the work you do. I can't stress that enough. It really is a divisive time in this country. And so I really appreciate organizations that look to bring people together, to have sometimes difficult, uncomfortable conversations, but to bring people together to get things done, which is what type of leadership I would bring to the AG's office. Hope to earn your support and stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And we hope that you appreciated that the more questions were asked, and Andrea was so gracious and giving us a very quick closing to ask for your endorsement. Before we end today, we just want to remind you that ORMA works when members and friends organize, and you can support the Green New Deal by organizing for the preservation of forests. So you'll see the link there posted. We have a couple of different asks for you today. The second is, or a few to be specific, the legislation to strengthen public health in the state is the second link that you see there. And you can also support the Democratic Party becoming more democratic. There's that campaign link. Read all about it and see if you might be interested in getting on board there. The final one is to sign up for the Fair Share Ballot Initiative, which I think most folks in ORMA are very supportive of. So if you haven't yet had a chance to investigate and get involved, then please check out that initiative. We are really looking forward to one more question and answer session starting in just a few minutes. So if you're on.
I just wanted to ask.
Oh, yes. Hi.
So I didn't want to interrupt, obviously, because I know we have a lot of written questions, but is there ever a time that we can ask questions, or is it just?
Samuel, oh, thank you for coming on. So there's a couple of different things. Typically, we have folks asking questions in the chat. And then we have like Solomon Steen and other ORMA volunteers try to rotate those right into the discussion. So today has been a little bit different, where we had a lot of questions packed in. I was looking at the chat and not seeing questions, so I apologize for not being very explicit about that at the outset. If you have questions that were not asked, we are in communication with the candidates, so you can always forward those. You see the ORMA information, put them in the chat now. We'll pick those up and forward them on to Andrea Campbell's campaign. And all the candidates have been very gracious about getting back to us, and then we can push that out via email. But my deepest apologies for not being explicit about that. The format today has been a little bit different than our past Q&A sessions. Does that answer that question?
No, you didn't. Thank you. And then we have the last one is coming up at 1, correct?
That is correct. So we're going to take a quick break unless we're able to transition that quickly. But I think we're, Henry, can you speak to that? The logistics of transition?
We'll be back on at 1. Hope to see you there, son.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much for being with us. So we'll see you in just a few minutes, everybody. Have a great one.